Today is Friday, 26th July, and we've seen further moves in the transfer of power in the United States away from incumbent President Joe Biden. Today, Barack Obama has come out and confirmed his support for Kamala Harris to be the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency in the presidential election in the United States in November. Obama has been the last major figure in the party to withhold his open endorsement of Harris. Now that Obama has come forward and confirmed his support for Kamala Harris, her election, if that's the right word, to the position of the Democratic Party's candidate for the candidacy of the party for the election in November, that is now a certainty. It's a done thing. You could almost say that it's going to happen at the convention by acclamation. It's been an astonishing process. We've had a primary campaign in which hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Democratic Party voters were invited basically to cast their votes for Joe Biden as their candidate. And they're now going to find that in November, they're given the option of voting either for Donald Trump or for Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris being, of course, the person they did not actually vote for. In fact, as various people have pointed out, Kamala Harris has been involved in two election cycles. The first was in 2020. We're now involved in the second one in 2024. In the 2020 election cycle, she pulled out of the race very early on without, as I remember, winning any convention delegates at all. She did not perform well, even in the early primaries. And of course, in this current election cycle, she has not participated in the primaries at all. She has been, in effect, selected as the Democratic Party's candidate by a small group of people who essentially, between them, control the nomination process of the Democratic Party and who have decided who the candidate should be without consulting the grassroots of the party at all. But anyway, the fact remains Kamala Harris will be the candidate. She will be elected by acclamation at the party convention in a few weeks' time, and she will be the candidate of the party in the election going forward. The only question now is who the person she's going to select for her vice president as the candidate to be her vice president will be. And as to that, well, we did a long discussion on the Duran yesterday with Robert Barnes, who is far more familiar with these kind of politics than I am. He suggested that it's most likely going to be Ben Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, because of Pennsylvania's critical importance as a swing state. We will see whether that happens. Much, I suspect, will depend on whether Shapiro himself wants to be the candidate. It's far from being a foregone conclusion, I suppose, that he does. Anyway, that's where we are in the politics of the United States. It's been a strange political operation. One can be intensely cynical about it, and I am, by the way. But realistically, given the collapse of Joe Biden in the presidential debate he had with Donald Trump, given the political pressures on Joe Biden to stand down from his wish to be the party's candidate in the election. The Democrats, once they'd managed to leverage Biden out, were left with no realistic alternative other than to go for Kamala Harris. Selecting another candidate would have been a complex and messy operation. I'm well aware that many people are saying that an open contest might have been exciting and might have been actually beneficial for the party. I understand the theory, but the electoral practice, in my experience, has been that parties that appear divided do extremely badly in elections, and those who run things within the Democratic Party clearly believe that division at this time, with the even greater risk of the convention in Chicago in August going completely off the rails, was too big a risk to play with. There is also the further factor that the Democratic Party has never come forward with a clear, strong alternative to Joe Biden. If there'd been some towering, eminent figure within the party who could have stepped in and taken charge, well, it might have been different. One might have said in that case, well, Kamala Harris, she might be the vice president, but realistically, this other person is in a better position to unite the party and to take the party forward to victory in the election in November. But there is no great towering person in the Democratic Party who is in any kind of position to do that. All sorts of names of people have been mentioned, people like Ben Shapiro himself, Newsom in California, Whitner, others. No doubt these are better known people in the United States than they are in Europe, and certainly better known to most Americans, or many Americans, than they are to me. But none of these people appears to me to be the kind of towering figure that the Democratic Party used to produce at one time. People like Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, whatever you may think of him, he was a powerful force in American politics long before he became president of the United States. Anyway, there's no one like that, it seems to me, in the politics of the Democratic Party now. The way the party has conducted its affairs for several years now, basically removing any potential challenger to the party mainstream, what you might call the party center, the DNC and its various, the apparatus, if you like, that controls the party. Anyway, that has ensured that no great figure could possibly emerge, and that, of course, is typical of what we see in Western politics altogether. So we get an individual, Kamala Harris, about whom I suspect that many people in the party have their doubts, but she is the vice president. That does put her in a position where it is difficult to circumvent her. Doing so, as I said, would risk chaos in the party without producing a better result. So they've all had to accept Harris and close ranks behind her and keep their fingers crossed and hope for the best. Well, we will see where it all goes. I'm going to say quickly, very briefly, I think that Kamala Harris, if she is elected in November, will be a continuation, largely a continuation of the administration that we have now, though she will be a figure with also little authority within the party, within the country, as somebody who has been selected through this complex process. And beyond that, she seems to me to have little actual experience in managing great institutions. She's never been a governor. She's only been briefly a senator. She's never run large companies or businesses or anything of that kind. I wonder whether she does have the expertise, the management skills, the administrative skills to run the government of the United States, and whether she has the political ideas and the vision to do so either. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell further on this. This is the way the United States, or at least the Democratic Party, conducts its affairs. I think the best thing to do now is to wait and see what happens. We're going to have a complex and interesting election going forward in a deeply polarized country, a country which has been made further polarized, in my opinion, by the incendiary rhetoric that has been coming out of the Biden White House, including in President Biden's last television address. So we have a divided, polarized country. Harris is going to have to deal with that. And it seems to me that in the Trump-Vance team, she has formidable adversaries against her. And of course, she's the candidate, but she's also the vice president. She's a member of the existing administration. I get the sense that her relationship with the president, the incumbent president, Joe Biden, is a rocky one. The president refuses to leave the scene. That means that Kamala Harris is not in control of what the administration is going to do between now and November. She has, on top of all her other problems, the further problem that she might find herself as a member of the administration defending policies carried out by the administration, which she might not want to defend and which it might not be in her interests to defend as the Democratic Party's candidate. But anyway, as I said, this is not my concern. I'm going to focus instead now on the geopolitical situation, and I'm going to return to that key topic now, which is the situation in Ukraine. Because the situation in Ukraine, the battleground situation in Ukraine, is becoming increasingly fraught for Ukraine. There's been further important news over the last 24 hours. The Russian offensive continues to gain momentum, and there seems to be nothing at all that Ukraine can do. So yesterday we got news that the Russians have either encircled and trapped completely the remaining Ukrainian forces in Krasnogorovka. This was what Russian reporters are claiming, or alternatively, Ukrainian reporters and some Western reporters and neutral reporters are saying that what's actually happened is that the Ukrainians have now pulled out completely from the remaining part of Krasnogorovka, rather than except for this, as I said, street that is leads from Krasnogorovka to the west, and that Krasnogorovka has been entirely abandoned to the Russians, and that the only issue now for the Russians is to reoccupy what is left of this territory. So Krasnogorovka, town of, I believe it was 14,000 people before the start of the conflict, one of the remaining the sole remaining fortified town controlled by Ukraine, close to Donetsk city, the area from which, the town from which, and the area around it, from which the heaviest shelling of Donetsk city was conducted by the Ukrainians. Well, this town has apparently either entirely fallen under Russian control or is about to do so with Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka trapped. And of course, all of this is coming with news of the big Russian advances further south around the village of Konstantinovka and along the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar further south, and in terms of the fighting that's going on in the village of Maximilianovka, the village immediately to the west of Kurakovo. Now, on the topic of Konstantinov, I've had an email from someone, a member of the community, who is annoyed with me for calling Konstantinovka this Konstantinovka, a village. He says he's looked it up. He finds that it's actually a fairly large place, which it is, that it would take you an hour roughly to walk around it, apparently. And he says that it isn't really a village at all, and that it should be described instead as a small town. Well, that is as may be. But the problem I face in these programs is that there are two completely different places called Konstantinovka, each of which are the subject of battles. One is the Konstantinovka we've just been talking about, the Konstantinovka, which is south of the town of Marinka, lies west of Novomikhailovka and Paraskovievka, which the Russians have already captured, and east of Kurakovo, the Konstantinovka, which connects with Vuhledar. There's that Konstantinovka, and then there is the much bigger Konstantinovka, the Konstantinovka, which is indisputably a town, which is located much further north, and which is located to the southwest of Chasiv Yar, where the fighting is now becoming very intense indeed. With that Konstantinovka, the big town of Konstantinovka, likely to be attacked by the Russians before very long. So, for that reason, accepting the fact that this Konstantinovka, the Konstantinovka that I've been talking about up to this moment, is probably more than just a big village, I am going to continue to refer to it as a village, simply to avoid more confusion between the two Konstantinovkas than I fear might exist already. This is, by the way, an issue with all discussions of this battlefront, of this war. There are many, many places in Donbass and eastern Ukraine which have identical names. For example, just to give another example, there is the Ocheretino, which the Russians captured, I think it was back in March, which is an important village sitting along the railway lines and the main roads, and the capture of which has enabled the Russians to advance both to the north and to the west and to the east. The Ocheretino that's located north of Avdiivka, and some distance further west, there is, believe it or not, yet another village which is also called Ocheretino, which sooner or later the Russians are also going to come to. So, for these reasons, I have to try and make distinctions between these places. So I'm going to stick to calling the Konstantinovka, which is southwest of Marinka and east of Kurakovo, as the village of Konstantinovka, despite the fact that we should accept that it is indeed, in fact, a very big village. Anyway, Krasnogorovka has either fallen or is about to fall either there are Ukrainian troops surrounded in this town or there are not. But if there are not, it's only because apparently they've retreated. And the capture of Konstantinovka, taken together with the Russian advances in Maximilianovka and the major Russian attack on Konstantinovka, the village of Konstantinovka, all of that tells us, taken together, that the Battle of Kurakovo is about to begin. Kurakovo, definitely a town, important logistical center, key hub supplying places like Vuhledar. And, well, the Russians, of course, by all accounts, have already cut the road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar. And as I've said already, they look like they're advancing beyond the road, pressing westwards towards the next supply road to Vuhledar. And if the village of Konstantinovka is also captured, Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar become extremely difficult. Now, over the last couple of hours, there has been a major Russian bombing offensive, apparently, north of Russian-controlled positions in Zaporozhye, and the Russians have also been pushing forward in the area of the Vremivka salient, advancing northwards there. Now, if you look at a map and you look at where Kurakovo is located and Vuhledar is located, it becomes very clear that any Russian advance towards, say, Orekhov, the town north of the village of Rabotino in Zaporozhye province, the town Orekhov, which formed the major logistics center and gathering place for the Ukrainian forces that undertook the offensive towards the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in the summer of 2023. Anyway, if Orekhov falls and if the Russians push the Ukrainians out completely from the Vremivka salient and also manage to capture the small town of Gulyapolye, well, then it becomes impossible to see how Ukrainian defenses in Vuhledar can be maintained and, in fact, taken together with the cutting off of the roads to Vuhledar and the forthcoming siege of Kurakovo, it is likely that Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass are going to collapse completely. Now that, of course, is not going to happen tomorrow or next week or the week after, but we are beginning to see these possibilities float upwards on the time horizon. And Syrskyi, the Ukrainian commander, and the Ukrainians generally are saying that there's up to 90,000 Ukrainian troops, Russian troops concentrated in the Zaporozhye area, ready to conduct an offensive. That, by the way, is a force twice as big as the force that the Russians have deployed in the north, in Kharkiv region. So that gives a sense of the size of the Russian forces that are being concentrated in this area. Well, if this army, this 90,000 men, really is launched into an attack and pushes northwards, and places like Orekhov are captured, and the Vremivka salient is cleared of the Ukrainians entirely, and Gulyapolye is captured as well, at a time when villages like Konstantinovka further north are also captured, and Maximilianovka, and the Battle of Kurakovo begins. Well, at that point, I would have thought that the Ukrainians would certainly have to pull out of Vuhledar, assuming that town had not been stormed by the Russians already. And of course, if that also happens, then the situation for the Ukrainians becomes critical. And it becomes critical in ways that we've not seen in Donbass before. Now, one of the things that has changed radically over the last few weeks as a result of the Russian advances is that the various Russian fronts, the Russian directions, the areas where the Russians are conducting their attacks are starting to merge with each other. So we will come in at a short time to talking about the Russian advances towards Pokrovsk. But of course, what happens in the area of Pokrovsk and what happens in the area of Vuhledar and what happens in Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk now. Well, if you go to a map, you start to see that they all start to come together. And for example, if the Russians are able to move forward from the positions that they've now occupied, which according to Julian Rebke has brought them within 20 kilometers of Pokrovsk and 14 kilometers of Mirnograd, if they're able to capture Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, they can, in theory, move up the main road and advance towards the important town of Pavlograd in Dnipropetrovsk region. But if Vuhledar falls, if Gulyapolye falls, if the Russians capture Orechov, then they can also advance towards the important town of Pavlograd from the south as well. And of course, Pavlograd is important because it is the last major town before the Dnieper itself is reached in this immediate area. And of course, the capture of Pavlograd would bring the Russians not only onto the east bank of the Dnieper, but directly opposite the key industrial city of Dnipropetrovsk, as the Russians call it, which has been one of the major supply centers for the Russians, sending supplies to their forces in Donbass. And indeed, if Pavlograd were to be reached in this way, well, one would have to say that the crisis for Ukraine at that point would deepen dramatically. And the same is happening if we go further east. If we go to the Toretsk sector, for example, and there have been significant Russian advances in the Toretsk sector as well. But amongst the advances that the Russians are conducting in the Toretsk sector, they are moving now from the villages from New York towards a succession of villages along the H20 highway. They seem to be moving towards the village of Alexandropil, for example, which is just west of the H20 highway. And ultimately, they look like they plan to advance north of Alexandropil, occupying more villages along the western side of the H20 highway as well. Now, the point about that is that these advances near Alexandropil and those other villages are actually very close to the advanced Russian positions, the positions that the Russians have already taken in places like Ocheretino, Keramik, Arhangelskoye, immediately to the west of the H20 highway. So you can see that the two directions, the Ocheretino direction, the Avdiivka-Ocheretino direction, and the Toretsk direction are showing signs also of starting to merge. And again, if you go to the Toretsk area specifically, we've had further news that the Russians have made major advances in the Toretsk area over the last 24 hours. We will come to those shortly. But again, if you look at a map, you can see that these advances in the Toretsk area are starting to bring the village of rather the town of Konstantinovka. This is the big town of Konstantinovka, and other places that we have come to think of as part of the Bakhmut battles. Villages like Kurdyumovka, Andreevka, Klesheyevka, and of course the town of Chasov Yar, that they're all coming into sight of the advancing Russians in the Toretsk area as well. So you can see that here also the front lines are starting to merge. The Russian advances in the Toretsk area are starting to converge with the advancing Russian forces in the Chasov Yar, Bakhmut area also. And this is a very important development. It means that the Russians at some point are going to be in a position to straighten their front lines, which will release many more troops than they have at the present time, because of course if you have a straightened front line rather than all sorts of wedges, then you are able to release troops that you can use to conduct further advances in all kinds of different directions. But of course also it makes for a more stable front, and it makes it easier to advance further westwards towards other places like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but ultimately towards the Dnieper as well. So anyway, let's now discuss a little bit more closely what is going on in the Ocheretino, Pokrovsk area. Now, over the last couple of days, there were lots of reports. They started to get into the Western media as well. Even someone like David Axe at Forbes has been writing about this. There are lots of reports that 2 battalions of the Ukrainian army, apparently drawn from the 51st Brigade, mechanized brigade, had become trapped in an emerging cauldron between the 2 villages of Lozovatska and Progres, which the Russians had just captured. And there was lots of complaints from the soldiers of these 2 battalions saying that they'd been given orders to stand and fight, and that they were being abandoned in effect by their command, and that they were being asked to fight to the last man and to defend themselves, and that this was unrealistic. And there was lots of talk about these soldiers surrendering en masse, or being killed in this cauldron or whatever. Well, the very latest report we've had, and I've no doubt that this is true, is that these men, the 2 battalions, the men of these 2 battalions, took the decision into their own hands, disobeyed orders, and simply fled from the area where they were about to be surrounded. And they fled across the fields, and they have apparently reached the village of Ivanivka, which the Russians are also in the process of attacking. And it's interesting to read people like David Axe writing about this as some greatest success of the Ukrainian army, presumably because a couple of hundred men of the Ukrainian army, instead of being killed or surrounded by the Russians, have escaped. But the fact is that what we're talking about is a rout of Ukrainian troops, a retreat, a panicky retreat carried out in direct contravention of orders. Now, you may think, as I absolutely do, that those orders were irrational. You may think that the soldiers did absolutely the right thing by taking the decision into their own hands and deciding to disobey those orders. But one way or the other, it is not at all a good look for the situation of the Ukrainian army on this battlefront. And in fact, there have been articles, including by David Axe in Forbes, but also one in the London Times, in which we read that the men of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the core brigade that has been trying to hold the Russians back in this area. Anyway, they're starting to complain that whenever they try to establish firm defense lines, they find themselves continuously outflanked by the Russians because other weaker Ukrainian brigades repeatedly collapse under the pressure, under Russian pressure. There's a long piece in the London Times about this, and in his earlier article in Forbes, David Axe basically said the same thing. Now, I think that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is overstating its prowess. It's hardly plausible that it can hold back the Russians all by itself. But the picture that is indeed emerging is of desperate Ukrainian attempts to try to stem the Russian advance. That surely is what those orders to the trapped men of the 51st Brigade was all about. It was an attempt to try to establish a front line to prevent further Russian advances towards Ivanivka. And those orders, the fact that those orders were disobeyed and that the Ukrainian troops fled, it means that all attempts by the Ukrainians to set up strong fortified lines in this area, or at least to hold the Russians back, that every one of them is now failing. And in fact, over the last couple of hours, we've had information about startlingly fast Russian advances in precisely this area. So there are reports that the Russians have now moved west from Progres and Ukr, that they've entered a village called Veselye, which is south of a road, the TO511 road. We'll come to its importance in a moment, that the Russians have now entered that particular village, that they've also pushed south from Ukr and are either approaching or about to enter another village called Zelanye, and that they have in fact reached Ivanivka itself, and that there is fighting going on in that particular village. Now, the key place to mention here, the key place to mention is in fact the road, the TO511 road, because this is the road that goes directly from Ocheretino past a small town called Grodivka, and if you continue along the road, you finally reach Mirnograd, which is, of course, the outer suburb of Pokrovsk itself. The Russians reach and capture Grodivka, then they are within close distance of Mirnograd. In fact, there is no remaining important settlement between Grodivka and Mirnograd itself. And again, as I said, if you look at a map, you will see that Ivanivka in particular lies very close to Grodivka. It is in fact the last major village between the current Russian positions and Grodivka. And if Ivanivka falls, an attack on Grodivka looks certain to come. There's been many discussions and comments about how the Ukrainian defenses here are collapsing, and we can see it. We can see how the Russians continue to advance relentlessly through these villages. Apparently, these advances are conducted mostly by Russian motorized rifle infantry. The Russians do have tanks. They do obviously have powerful aviation in this area. Their FPV drones and their operators are very, very active. Their surveillance drones are all over the place. Their artillery is active as well. But this is essentially an advance by Russian light, regular infantry. But the Russians are able to conduct, as I've said previously, proper armoured assaults. This is, I think, the most fluid battle in the war that I have seen up to this time so far. It's, as I said in a recent programme, it's the battle which most closely approximates to the conception of war that I had in my mind before the special military operation started. And none of this, of course, has yet happened, has happened. This collapse in the front lines east of Pokrovsk, none of this has happened. What has not yet happened, rather, is that there has not yet been an assault on Vozdvizhenka, the key village further north that lies along the main highway from Pokrovsk and Mirnograd to Konstantinovka, the town of Konstantinovka, and to Chasov Yar. And that attack on Vozdvizhenka, I think, is certain to come at some point within the next few weeks. Maybe once the Russians have reached Grodivka. And of course, if they reach Grodivka, the Ukrainians admit they've now captured Novoselivka Persha. The Russians can also continue to advance westwards from Novoselivka Persha. They can move also towards Selidove and other villages like Novogrodivka, which is another village to the south of Grodivka itself. And at that point, they can start to threaten Ukrainian positions along another road, the E50 highway, which is the same highway that they're advancing along through the village of Karlovka, further south, where bitter fighting is already taking place. And of course, if Selidovo is, if the Russians advance along this road, the E50 highway, not only does that bring them to Selidovo, but at that point, again, as I've said already, the other battles, the battles for Kurakovo and the other places further south, start to merge with these battles, this big battle for Pokrovsk, which is coming. So these are extraordinarily rapid Russian advances. One gets the sense that not only are Ukrainian defenses in this area extremely disorganized, but that the brigades, apart possibly from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which has by now been very, very battered by continuous fighting, that the Ukrainian defenses are simply not strong, and that the Ukrainians have no clear idea of where they can fall back to establish stable defense lines. It could be that the Russians will only start to slow down when they have reached Pokrovsk itself, and when the battle for that town seriously begins. Anyway, all this is dramatic enough, but it's perhaps even exceeded in drama by what has been going on in Toretsk. And Toretsk is an extraordinary battle. First of all, it is a battle on an enormous scale. Nobody has provided numbers for the number of Russian troops that must be operating in the Toretsk area, but it must be very large, and it is clear that the Ukrainians, again, are finding it impossible to withstand Russian advances in the Toretsk area, because as well as the reports that we had already received about the Russians having captured the village of Pivnichne, which is located immediately to the east of Toretsk, there are now reports that the Russians have also captured most of, and perhaps all of, another village called Zalizny, which is located south of Pivnichne, start closing the gap between the advanced Russian positions in New York and, in other words, bringing these two pincers, the one in the south in New York and the one in the north in Pivnichne and Zalizny, the pincers are starting to close. And there are now pictures, and apparently this is film. This is not speculation of reporters or mapping projects. There is actual film which shows Russian positions now occupying buildings which are located in specifically buildings that are occupying areas close to an area of open ground, beyond which there is a single building, which is an agricultural college, and beyond that building we arrive at the metropolitan centre, which is of course Toretsk itself. And alongside all of that, there are reports that the Russians not only are in the business of clearing all of these villages, Pivnichne, Zalizny, New York, another village called Druzhba, which is located immediately to the north of Pivnichne. But they seem to be doing this at extraordinary speed. Now, I have followed battles in these dense urban environments before, in the fighting in Ukraine. I've seen battles like this take place in the Mariupol area, in the area of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. This was in the spring and summer of 2022. I've seen battles like this in Mariupol, areas fighting going on in the area of Mariupol. Of course, there was the huge battle of Bakhmut. There was the Avdiivka battle. And of course, there's now been the battle for Krasnogorovka. But I have never seen Russian troops move so quickly through a fortified, built-up area as they are currently doing in Toretsk. Given how complex this urban area is, and one must imagine Toretsk as a town at the center of a string of villages, all of which are almost contiguous with each other, with structures, industrial structures from mines, the mining industry, the old Soviet mining industry, coal mines, waste heaps, also high-rise buildings, micro-districts of the kind that the Soviet Union used to build. Anyway, it's been a sort of belt of these places, all consolidated by fortified positions. Usually, it takes months for the Russians. Well, up to now, it has taken months for the Russians to grind through defenses like this. What we have seen in Toretsk are advances take place over a period of roughly 6 weeks, which earlier in the war might have taken 6 to 10 months. And, well, there are obviously explanations for this. The Russians are obviously far better organized now for this kind of combat. They almost certainly outnumber the Ukrainian defenders, which was not the case, by the way, in many of the earlier battles. The Ukrainians are much weaker, far less well organized. They're short of artillery. They're short of drones. The Russian electronic warfare drones are far more effective. The Russian Air Force is very much more busy than it used to be. It can drop bombs, heavy fab bombs on Ukrainian defenses, smashing the defensive positions, destroying the fortified positions, enabling the Russians to break through. But, even if one allows for all of that, there is something about the Toretsk battles that is difficult to understand exactly why or how it is turning out that this advance by the Russians is so much faster than we've seen in previous battles. There are unanswered questions about it. And I can't help but think that the answer to those questions is deteriorating Ukrainian morale. Just as Ukrainian troops have apparently withdrawn from Krasnogorovka, fled from encirclement between north of Progres and Lastochkino. So I get the sense that Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian troops, are not prepared to defend positions in places like Toretsk with anything like the determination that they showed earlier in the war. And that's almost certainly a sign that more and more Ukrainian soldiers sense that the war is lost and are saying to themselves that there's no point in them laying down their lives for a lost cause. Anyway, dramatic events in Toretsk. Again, I was looking at some of the maps last night, and I was looking at the same maps this morning, and I confess that I was astonished. As I said, the whole of Zaliznia seems to have been suddenly come under Russian control with a speed that I would have thought impossible. The Russians, as I said, now in a position where they've almost reached Toretsk itself. Battle for Toretsk likely to start fairly soon. And again, it's difficult to explain how these advances are happening so quickly, but the fact is that they are happening, and there doesn't seem to be any doubt about this. And the battle, therefore, for Toretsk is becoming critical for the Ukrainians as well. Now, we've had less news from some of the other battlefronts. I sense that there's a lot of fighting going on in Chasiv Yar, that the Russians are still fighting for the central part of the city and are probably attacking Chasiv Yar from the north. Most of the mappers think that they're focused instead on moving towards the village of Grigorivka, north of Chasiv Yar and east of the aqueduct, and I'm sure that is true, but I don't think that this is the only fighting in the Chasiv Yar area which is taking place. And the same is true of Siversk. There's been less news about the fighting in Siversk as well, though everybody concedes that the Russians are advancing there also. And, lastly, lots of very confusing news about what's going on in the Kupiansk area. But again, everybody agrees that the Russians are advancing steadily in the Kupiansk area, taking village after village, moving not just closer to the Oskol and Zherebets river lines, but perhaps in one or two places, Russian reconnaissance groups have now reached the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And it does look as if a major attack on the Oskol, the remaining villages on the Oskol and Zherebets rivers are imminent. The Russians, of course, have already captured Mercouris on the east bank of the Zherovets River, and that does put them in a strong position where they can advance towards Kupiansk from the north and also clear the other villages to the south. And of course, once those villages to the south are captured, the Russians can cross the rivers and advance towards Liman and towards Slavyansk. Now, for what it is worth, I believe that the Russian advances in this area are being slowed by the continuing difficult fighting that the Russians are facing further north in Volchansk. Volchansk in Kharkiv region is the only area where the Ukrainians are defending with anything like the kind of determination they have shown in the past. It's the only place where Ukrainian forces appear to be continuing to resist. And so far as I can see, the Ukrainian counterattack in Gluboka, village close to Lipsy, has been a complete failure. The Russians have pushed the Ukrainians completely out of Gluboka. But the Russians have, and I think we have to confirm this, the pictures confirm this, the Russians have still not fully captured the entire area of the high-rise buildings in northern Volchansk, the area of the so-called citadel. They seem to have reduced the area of the citadel to basically to ruins. One has huge pity for the Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to defend themselves in this area under this endless rain of bombs and missiles that the Russians are dropping on them. But they are still fighting there. I thought some days ago that the citadel area might have fully fallen under Russian control. Some parts of it undoubtedly have, but the Ukrainians continue to resist in other parts. And I think this is the main battle in the Volchansk area. When the Russians finally break Ukrainian defenses in this area of the high-rise buildings in northern Volchansk, then I think the rest of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, will fall rapidly under their control. At that point, they can then take full advantage of the bridgeheads that they've established south of the Volcha River and to the east of the Seversky Donets Canal. And then we're probably going to see, after Volchansk finally falls, a further Russian advance, though it will not be an advance towards Kharkiv city. Some Western commentators assume. Rather, it will be an attack by the Russians, an advance by the Russians southwards to link up with their forces further south in Kupiansk. Volchansk is on the main road to Kupiansk. If the Russians can capture this road, then the Russian operations in the Kupiansk area will no doubt begin. We'll see major Russian advances and a drive by the Russians to capture not just Kupiansk itself, but all of the remaining territories in Kharkiv region that they abandoned in the face of the Ukrainian advance in the autumn of 2022. Now, what the Ukrainian losses are in all of this fighting, I absolutely do not want to even speculate about. The Russians tell us the Ukrainians are losing around 2,000 men dead and wounded every day. I've already explained that a recent report in Reuters appeared to bear that out from Ukrainian sources close to the general staff. There are admissions in the Western media today that despite the mobilization, Ukrainian units remain critically under strength. The Ukrainian army is unable to fill in the gaps. Syrskyi has cast doubt now on the effectiveness of the F-16s. As I said, the situation is terrible and becoming worse. And if I can just revisit an old topic, about a month ago, there was a really rather interesting discussion. You can find it on YouTube about tanks, and it was conducted by Jerome Starkey of the British newspaper The Sun, a famous, or perhaps infamous, if you prefer, British tabloid, and Dr. Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. Dr. Watling, I should say, is, in my opinion, one of the most sane and level-headed and intelligent commentators, certainly in Britain, on the course of the war. Anyway, these two, Mr. Starkey and Dr. Watling, were discussing, I will say it straightforwardly, the failure of Western tanks in Ukraine. Now, Starkey was from the team with the Sun, which went to Ukraine to see the Ukrainian troops training on the Challenger 2s. He was on the Challenger 2, which embarrassingly sank in the mud. That obviously had a major effect on his understanding of the problems the Ukrainians face in the war. And anyway, he and Dr. Watling discussed the situation with the Western tanks. And the basic thing that came out of this program was that Western tanks are much too heavy. They typically weigh over 60 tons. In fact, they weigh significantly more than 60 tons if all the various bits and bobs that they need to carry are added on. And that makes them completely unsuitable for use on Ukrainian battlefields, where the ground is often soft, where the road bridges aren't always strong enough to withstand vehicles of this sort of weight, and all of that. And I have to say, watching this program, I got a terrible sense of déjà vu. Because when the topic of supplying Western tanks was first floated seriously at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, I can distinctly remember myself making programs, making exactly the same observation, that Western tanks are far too heavy. They're not just too heavy in terms of the soil conditions and the road conditions in Eastern Europe. In my opinion, they are too heavy altogether. Whatever it was that happened during the Cold War, instead of tanks, what happened in the West is that Western armies and Western military industrial complex began to create what were, to all intents and purposes, heavy mechanized pillboxes. The sheer size and weight of these machines means that they are completely unsuited to rapid maneuver on a battlefield against a peer opponent. And essentially, if you follow this program carefully, that is what Dr. Watling and Mr. Starkey were saying. And I don't think this is only true of the battlefronts in Ukraine. It is a myth that all of Western Europe, for example, has strong, asphalted, smooth, metalled roads, that all the road bridges across Western Europe are fit to carry these enormous tanks. That's completely not true. As for soft soil conditions, anybody who, like me, has walked across the English countryside will know that Britain is full of soft ground. In fact, I believe I'm right in saying that the British Isles have more peat conditions than pretty much anywhere else, and there are bogs and swamps which you can find in all sorts of places, and they could actually be dangerous to walkers if walked over at the wrong time of year and without proper understanding of what one is doing. I don't think you will find anywhere in the world where these enormous heavy tanks really would function properly against mobile tanks. Now, Dr. Watling, the kind of mobile tanks that the Russians have. Now, Dr. Watling said that Russian tanks don't have the level of protection that Western tanks do, even for their given weight. I wonder what his basis for saying that actually is. And they all said, both Starkey and Watling said, that Western tank guns are far more accurate than Russian tank guns. Again, I am not sure what actual evidence they have to support that claim. I have not seen it play out that way at all on the battlefronts in Ukraine. In fact, I can recall that there was at least one occasion when a T-72 engaged in long-range fire against an US Abrams tank and knocked the Abrams tank out. So I'm not sure on what basis they say that. Maybe the older tanks were less accurate, probably because their optics were not as advanced as those of modern tanks. And maybe also the tank guns that the Soviets installed on some of their tanks once upon a time were less accurate than, say, Western tank guns are today. But I am not sure that this is right at all. Anyway, the other thing I noticed is that Dr. Watling was asked to say what he thought was the optimal weight for a modern tank, and he said that it was 55 tons, which is more than the contemporary Russian tanks, but which, as it happens, is the exact weight of the T-14 Armata tank that the Russians have now put into service. Apparently, it has now joined the Russian army, according to Rostec at least, though it has not yet appeared on the battlefronts in Ukraine. Just saying, it is remarkable to me that it has taken, well, a year and a half of fighting, actual fighting, for Western analysts, and Dr. Watling is a very fine analyst and just about the best there is, in my opinion. It's taken a year and a half for them to come to the absolutely obvious conclusion that Western tanks are too heavy. And it's not, by the way, just a question of manoeuvring against over, soft soil or having problems with roads and things like that. As I remember pointing out also in my previous program, and as is based on my own direct knowledge and experience, a 60-ton tank is by definition going to require at least double the logistical and maintenance support as a 40-ton tank does, and is going to be inherently much less reliable than, say, a 40-ton tank is. The bigger, heavier a vehicle is, the more complex it becomes, the more the stresses on the various parts of the machine increase under the weights, and the more likely and prone it is to experience mechanical breakdowns. And if one knows anything at all about Western tanks, it is that they have a constant habit of breaking down. Russian tanks, of course, break down also, but at nothing like the same level, from what I understand, than Western tanks do. If one looks at present procurement decisions and discussions about new types of tanks, absolutely nothing in the West is going to change. The Challenger 3, successor to the current Challenger 2 in Britain, is going to be even heavier than the already ridiculously over-heavy Challenger 2. We're probably going to get an 80-ton tank with the Challenger 3. That's not, I think, an unreasonable guess. And Dr. Watling was talking about an argument he had with an American army officer who insisted that the optimal weight for a tank was more like 58 tons than the 55 tons that Dr. Watling was talking about. Anybody who knows anything about the way in which tanks or vehicles of any kind are designed knows that if you aim for a 58-ton tank, you're going to end up with a tank that weighs at least 65 tons. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's all I'm going to say on that rather tangled subject, but one which, as I said, highlights the realities about Western procurement practices. Now, I ought to say, in total fairness, that there are some people who finally, in the West, are starting to get a genuine sense of how bad things are becoming and of how things are going wrong and of the completely ill-considered and ill-conceived policies of Western governments. And again, I owe my debt to this article, which I'm going to discuss now, to the historian Jeff Roberts, who's just passed it on to me. And it's an article in Politico. And it is written by two gentlemen whom I have no previous knowledge of, Christopher M. Callion and Benjamin H. Friedman. The one is a fellow and the other a policy director at something called Defence Priorities, which I presume is another one of these think tanks on defence issues, of which we have so many in the West. But the article in Politico is a model of good sense. And of course, it says things that you've heard many times on this channel and which you will have heard us also say on the Duran. And we're not, of course, the only people to have said them. Daniel Davis, Douglas McGregor, Brian Balletic, lots of people like that have been saying these things too. But it's always refreshing and somehow reassuring to find these things written in a place like Politico. And one hopes that someday, one day, finally, it will all break through. And just as the penny has dropped in Ukraine, that they're losing the war, thus their hurried dispatch of Kuleba to Beijing and their urgent pleas to the Vatican for diplomatic help, so maybe one day over the next couple of weeks, the penny will drop in the West that if a geopolitical catastrophe in Ukraine is to be avoided, then a movement towards peace and a reversal of policy might finally take place. I wonder, for example, whether people like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance aren't taking an interest in this sort of article. Anyway, the article, which is in Politico, says that NATO's false promises are encouraging misplaced Ukrainian hopes. The alliance's irresponsible policy towards Ukraine continues, providing false hope, making peace less likely and the war more dangerous. And the article then talks about the latest NATO summit, which says offered Ukraine a fresh round of false hope in its war, which is worse than doing nothing. It talks about the renewed commitment for Ukraine to join NATO someday. It calls this constant harping on Ukraine one day joining NATO a charade, which is what it is. And it says that it is nothing new, but has now come at an especially bad time. And it says absolutely rightly that Washington and European capitals are unfortunately doubling down, at least rhetorically, continuing to claim Ukraine will someday join NATO. In fact, after promoting a vague bridge to Ukraine's eventual membership, the NATO gathering NATO leaders claimed Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards entry. And the article then goes on to say it would be foolish to admit Ukraine to NATO now or ever. Any possible scenario of Ukraine accession presents an insoluble dilemma. The country can't be admitted while at war with Russia, most importantly because doing so would immediately throw NATO and Russia into a nuclear crisis. Any commitment to defend Ukraine in the future wouldn't be credible. The underwriter of the alliance, the United States, has already demonstrated that it won't fight and risk nuclear war on Ukraine's behalf, even when the latter's survival is at stake, as the United States doesn't have a vital interest in doing so, a point former President Barack Obama made explicitly in 2016. Simply put, the West's promises are empty talk, and Ukraine's NATO membership appears off the table for the moment. Nonetheless, even false promises can bring real danger, and this can present itself in several forms. First, any prospect of Ukraine's NATO membership, however dubious, preserves a key cause of the war, giving Russia incentive to prolong the conflict in order to forestall Ukraine's accession. It's a point I've made many times, that constantly saying that Ukraine will one day join NATO when the war is over simply incentivizes Russia to continue the war until it is finally completely victorious. And the article then goes on to say, as with the draft treaties Russia submitted in December 2021 and the Istanbul negotiations conducted in March and April 2022, any resolution will inevitably be conditioned on Ukraine not joining NATO. Second, false promises encourage false hope, which will only motivate Ukraine to continue following its failing strategy to regain all the territory it has lost and eschew negotiations with Moscow. And the article then discusses Ukraine's increasingly grave situation in the war, and goes on to say that Russia might prove unwilling to accept any sort of armistice, even around the territorial status quo, and successful talks could take years. But what NATO's rhetoric is helping postpone isn't certain peace, rather than initial steps towards it. In other words, if the Ukrainians finally put aside talk of NATO membership, then they can perhaps sit down and talk with the Russians, and though those talks may be difficult, and although the Russians may hold out for more territory than Ukraine is prepared to give, and though the Russians are certain to refuse to make significant territorial concessions to Ukraine or to return to the February 2022 front lines, at least talks can begin, and that might bring us eventually towards peace. And not only does constant harping on Ukraine's future in NATO offer Ukraine false hopes, but it does something else. It also increases the risk for American and other NATO countries. The longer the war drags on, the greater the threat of escalation. This is already evident in the salami slicing approach the United States has taken, sending increasingly long-range weapons to Ukraine and rubber stamping their use on targets inside Russia. Ukraine has already used its own indigenous capabilities to strike Russian radar stations, which are designed to provide early warning in case of an American nuclear attack. And last month, submunitions from a US-supplied missile fired by Ukrainian forces fell on civilian beachgoers in Crimea, likely after being intercepted by Russian air defense. These events raise acute concerns. Attacking early warning systems erodes Russia's confidence in its ability to respond in the event of a nuclear first strike, thereby increasing the risk of Russia's nuclear use. But a more likely outcome is that Moscow will respond to the attacks on its soil that employ US-provided weapons by finding ways to directly target the United States or its helping parties. Ukraine's attacks in Russia also raise questions about whether the United States can stop Kiev from drawing it into direct conflict as the situation grows more dire. And then the article makes an entirely valid point, one made many times, by the way, by Glenn Deason. Analysts who see themselves as Ukraine's boosters often insist the West mustn't cave to nuclear blackmail because escalation to nuclear war is unlikely. But the accurate name for nuclear blackmail is nuclear deterrence, and it doesn't require assurance that disaster will occur, only a fear that it might. These commentators seem to believe our ability to deter Russia relieves us of the burden of being deterred by them, like playing chicken without comprehending that the risk of collision is mutual. I couldn't put it better. In fact, I've never said it as well, if I may say. These commentators seem to believe our ability to deter Russia relieves us of the burden of being deterred by them, like playing chicken without comprehending that the risk of collision is mutual. The logic is deranged under any circumstances, but especially in the case of Ukraine, where the balance of resolve between the United States and Russia is overwhelmingly in the latter's favor. The risk of nuclear war may be low, but its apocalyptic consequences demand we labor to keep it that way. And that, again, is absolutely right. It's a point, by the way, that not just I, but Daniel Davis especially has made many times. If the risk of nuclear war is 1 in 100, that is already much too high. And then the article goes on to say, NATO has continued its irresponsible policy towards Ukraine, providing false hope, making peace less likely and the war more dangerous. Another kind of summit, one infused with realism, would have admitted that Ukraine can't win in the grand sense it has defined victory and that NATO won't defend it. That would have been a bridge to better prospects for a reasonable peace in Ukraine, not to mention improved security for NATO, and by the way, for peace in Europe and indeed the world. Well, as I said, there are some people in the United States who talk in this way. Hopefully, they will gain traction now that the Trump-Vance camp seem to have gone completely over to their side, bringing along with them many others. We will see what the Kamala Harris team come up with, whether they intend to follow where President Biden has led and continue to double down on unending and unceasing support for Ukraine. But it is at least a relief to see that some people in the United States are talking like this, even though I have to say that I don't think there's much sign of any great change in policy for the moment. We're talking about Ukraine. My sense is that the Ukrainians, as Sofia Midkiff put it to me in a conversation, the Ukrainians have come intellectually to the understanding over the last few weeks that they have lost the war, but emotionally still can't accept it. So they speak to the Vatican and they send Kuleba to Beijing, but they don't come with any serious proposals, and they seem to think that the Chinese can help them get a ceasefire before negotiations begin, which the Ukrainians then will never really conduct in good faith, whereas the Russians have made it absolutely clear that negotiations must precede a ceasefire. Now, we've had this explained many times by Russian officials, but we have had it explained again by the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, in comments which he has made to the UN Security Council. He said that, "I will say from the start that the Kiev regime's stated readiness for negotiations in principle fits into our position that the diplomatic way is the preferable way to solve the conflict in Ukraine. As you know, we have never rejected negotiations. Zelensky did, instigated by his Western sponsors. If he has really matured enough for a talk for peace, there are proposals put forward by the President of Russia a month ago, and we advise him to make haste. Ukraine will definitely not get anything better than that." And then TASS goes on to say that Nebenzia added that Kiev will not get a breather on the battlefield in form of a preliminary ceasefire. Dear colleagues, before messengers, this is again Nebenzia, before messengers start coming to us asking to assess the potential change in the rhetoric of the expired leader of the Kiev regime, who suffers a fiasco on the battlefield, we implore you to find out the details of its sudden epiphany. It's quite possible that nothing has actually changed in its assessments, and that Russia had to find out how trustworthy Ukrainian schemes are on the example of the Minsk agreements. So what Nebenzia is basically saying is very simple. Ukrainians want to talk. We are ready to talk. We have always been ready to talk. We set out our conditions. The Ukrainians are welcome to sit down and talk with us about those conditions. But if they think we are stupid enough to agree a ceasefire before we have had substantive negotiations with them, they are deluding themselves. First, there must be the negotiations, and those negotiations must be conducted in a way that we are satisfied means that the Ukrainians are acting in good faith, and that means that there must be Ukrainian actions leading to a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the four regions. If that happens, then, but not before, a ceasefire can take place. But if the Ukrainians, on the contrary, think that they can just string us along, as they have done in the past, get us to agree to a ceasefire by promises of negotiations, which they have no real belief in, well, we're not going to be fooled that way again. And that is the reality. That is the reality that Ukraine needs to face, that the Western powers need to face, that NATO needs to face, if there is indeed to be a peaceful settlement of this crisis in Ukraine. To repeat again what Nebenzia said, Kiev will not get a breather at the battlefield in form of a preliminary ceasefire. It is there clearly set out in the TASS dispatch, and no one should expect that will change. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget, you can check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And by the way, just to say, tomorrow I expect I shall be discussing the latest events in the Russian economy, the fact that the economy is continuing to grow much faster than the central bank had ever imagined it would, and its decision today, its entirely correct decision today in the circumstances to raise interest rates. But that's for tomorrow. This is where I finish today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And let me remind you again, I'll be back tomorrow, and have a good day until then.